See that SUV stuck up there? Yeah, that's Karen's. She kept parking across my farm road like she owned the whole place. So, I used my tractor, a few heavy straps, and a little basic physics to move her brand new luxury Escalade to a spot where it couldn't block my road anymore. No dents, no scratches, no broken laws, just one very expensive lesson about boundaries. But to understand how her SUV ended up sitting there like a showroom display gone horribly wrong, we need to go back to where all of this began. I didn't always live on this farm. For 25 years, I worked in logistics management, the kind of job where every phone call brought another problem and every day ended with 3 new emergencies waiting for me. I was constantly tired, constantly stressed, and constantly pretending everything was fine. Until one day it wasn't. I quit my job, sold my condo, cashed out part of my retirement, and bought 80 acres in rural Nebraska. No HOA, no traffic, no committee meetings, just land, cattle, fences, unpredictable weather, and peace. That peace lasted until Karen showed up. The first time I saw her, she was parked sideways across my farm road in a white Escalade, holding her phone up like she was recording something extremely important. I assumed she was lost. I walked over calmly and politely and said, "Morning. Can I help you with something?" She barely glanced in my direction. "No, I'm fine." I explained that she was parked on private property and needed to move because farm equipment regularly used that road. She simply waved me off and said she needed the spot because the 5G signal was better there and she was trying to live stream some HOA business. HOA business, apparently, was enough to make trespassing acceptable. I told her there was no easement across my property. That finally got her attention. She lowered her sunglasses and said, "You must be new." That one sentence told me almost everything I needed to know. I calmly explained that I owned the land and there was no legal access through my farm road. She smiled at me like I was some confused child interrupting the adults and said the HOA had historical access and that I'd eventually figure it out. Then she looked back at her phone and completely dismissed me while standing on my own property. 2 days later, she came back. Same road, same tree, same angle. This time, she wasn't even pretending to work. She had the seat reclined, the AC running full blast, a cold drink in one hand, and she was filing her nails underneath my shade tree like she'd personally reserved the spot. I walked over and reminded her that we'd already had this conversation. She told me the developer had informed them that they had access and said she didn't have time to argue over semantics. Semantics? That was her word for property ownership. I pointed out that the main road leading into Meadowbrook Estates was only 3 miles away. She said that route was ugly, had too much traffic, and didn't have enough shade. Here, she had quiet, shade, and a strong phone signal. She called it perfectly harmless. Harmless to her, not to me. My road wasn't some decorative driveway. It was a working farm road. Tractors, trailers, feed deliveries, livestock movement, all of it depended on that access. But Karen didn't see land as something that had a purpose. She saw it as empty space that she could use whenever it made her own day more convenient. And once she realized I was trying to remain civil, she started pushing even harder. Her visits became routine. 3 times a week, usually around the same hour, always underneath the same oak tree. Sometimes she was live streaming. Sometimes she was drinking iced coffee. Sometimes she simply sat there, apparently determined to prove that she could. Every conversation followed the exact same pattern. I'd tell her she was on private property. She'd claim community access. I'd explain there was no easement. She'd tell me I was arguing semantics. Then came the day she finally crossed the line. I was hauling feed when I heard a long, aggressive blast from a vehicle horn. Not a quick tap. Not a warning. A full angry blast that echoed across the pasture and sent the herd scrambling. I came around the corner and there she was, blocking the road, one hand on the horn and the other waving at me like I was some kind of valet. "You need to move your tractor," she snapped. My tractor wasn't even blocking her. It was parked off to the side, the engine was shut down, and the keys were in my pocket. I told her exactly that. She honked again anyway. The cattle immediately lifted their heads. A few calves scrambled away. Then I heard a sharp metallic clang followed by a painful bellow. One of my best pregnant heifers had spooked and slammed herself against the metal trough. She struggled back onto her feet, limping badly and favoring one rear leg. I told Karen she'd injured one of my animals. She glanced over for barely a second and said, "She looks fine. You're being dramatic." That was the exact moment my patience changed. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten her. But something inside me went completely cold. Karen wasn't simply entitled. She was indifferent. My property, my livestock, my responsibility, none of it mattered to her as long as she remained comfortable. The next morning, I checked the heifer again. She was definitely injured. Dr. Patterson, the local large animal veterinarian, came out, examined her carefully, and told me she'd strained several ligaments and might have cracked the vet told me there was a serious chance she'd strained the socket edge. Even worse, she was 6 months pregnant, and that level of stress could trigger an early delivery. He looked at me and asked what had happened. I told him a woman had leaned on her horn and sent the whole herd into a panic. He stared at me for a moment and said, "You need to fix that." He wasn't talking about the heifer. So I went home, pulled out every property record I had, the deed, maps, surveys, tax documents, old agreements, and went through everything line by line. There was no easement, no access clause, no shared road, nothing that gave anyone permission to use my farm road. I took the entire folder to my attorney, Jim Sutton, in town. He reviewed every document and confirmed exactly what I'd suspected. She was trespassing every single time she came onto the property. Then he told me the part that really mattered. If I wanted the case to survive in court, I needed documentation. Photos, dates, video, warnings, witnesses, and a paper trail so complete that nobody could simply explain it away. I left his office with dark clouds building over the western horizon and an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. Dr. Patterson's warning kept replaying in my head. Too much stress could cause premature labor. That evening, the storm arrived hard and fast, and Karen returned at the worst possible moment. By sunset, the sky had turned a deep purple and green, the kind of sky that makes experienced farmers stop what they're doing and stare upward. Wind hammered the barn walls. Rain came down sideways. Around 9 that night, I found the injured heifer lying in the mud. She had gone into labor far too early, and the calf was positioned incorrectly. I called Dr. Patterson immediately. He told me to get her loaded and bring her to his clinic. I managed to get her into the trailer, climbed into my truck, pulled toward the farm road, and then stopped completely. Karen's white Escalade was sitting sideways across the only exit, hazard lights flashing through the rain. I jumped out, ran to her driver's window, and shouted that I had a heifer in labor and needed to get through. She lowered the window only a couple of inches and said, "Do you mind? I'm trying to check the flood levels." I told her again that this was an emergency. She looked toward the trailer, shrugged, and said, "It's just a cow." Then she complained that her tires weren't going into the mud and rolled the window back up. I stood there in the pouring rain, barely 10 feet from her warm, comfortable SUV, listening to a pregnant animal suffering behind me. That's the kind of sound a rancher never forgets. I called Patterson again. He told me that if I couldn't reach the clinic, I would have to turn the calf myself or risk losing both the mother and the calf. So I climbed into the trailer in the middle of that violent storm and did exactly what he instructed. Mud reached my knees. Rain blew through the open trailer. Lightning flashed through the slats while thunder rattled the metal walls. The heifer was trembling, exhausted, and barely able to stand. I reached inside, found the calf's back legs, and carefully began rotating it, inch by inch, contraction by contraction. Blood, rain, and straw mixed together beneath us while the storm continued outside. And through it all, Karen remained parked 10 feet away in that Escalade, completely dry and comfortable. Finally, I got the calf turned and pulled it free. First, it didn't move. I cleared its airway, rubbed its chest, and kept working until it coughed and finally took a breath. The heifer survived. The calf survived. But that night changed something inside me permanently. Karen hadn't simply ignored a property boundary. She had blocked a genuine life-or-death emergency and refused to move. Standing beneath the barn light afterward, soaked, exhausted, and shaking, I made myself a promise. The next time she parked on my property, I wasn't going to move her with words. I'd move her with physics. The very next morning, Karen came back. Same oak tree, same smug timing, same attitude. That told me everything. She wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She was testing how far she could push me. So I stopped arguing and started documenting. I photographed her Escalade from several angles, making sure the private property sign was clearly visible in every shot. I photographed the tire tracks and recorded the exact location. I clipped on my body camera before walking over. Then I told her calmly that I was documenting repeated trespassing. She rolled her eyes and repeated the same story about the developer and some mysterious map that supposedly gave her access. I told her I was calling the sheriff. She smiled and said, "Go ahead." So I did. Deputy Trujillo arrived a short time later, examined the vehicle, spoke with Karen, and then told her plainly that she'd already been warned and was trespassing. He gave her one final warning and explained that the next incident could result in a citation. She finally drove away slowly, as if making a dramatic exit somehow meant she'd won. She hadn't won. She'd just given me more proof. As soon as she left, I started preparing. I laid everything I needed across my workbench. Soft toe straps, padded recovery slings, tie-down loops, clevises, stabilization ropes, and equipment designed to move the vehicle without scratching the chrome or damaging the plastic. Then I inspected the old oak tree and the wide stump beside the ditch. I measured the distances, checked the ground, and studied where I measured exactly where the rear axle sat when Karen parked, checked the slope, and marked the ground with small survey flags. I wasn't planning to damage her vehicle. I was planning to make sure it couldn't move. Later that afternoon, Karen came back with reinforcements. 3 other HOA loyalists arrived in luxury vehicles, carrying clipboards, phones, and enough confidence to start their own government. They walked onto my property and announced that they were there to resolve a community access issue. I asked them what community access they were talking about. My driveway? They repeated the same tired story about the developer, an emergency overflow route, and supposed HOA rights. I told them once again that there was no easement. Then Karen made things worse by announcing that she was intentionally leaving her Escalade there as evidence for their attorney. Then she made the mistake that settled everything. She locked the vehicle, took the keys, pointed directly at me, and said that if anyone touched her SUV, she'd sue them into bankruptcy. Then she and her little HOA entourage drove away, leaving the Escalade sitting abandoned on my property, perfectly positioned beneath the oak. The rear axle was aligned exactly where I'd measured it. The angle was perfect. The setup was almost too convenient. I didn't rush. I walked completely around the Escalade and recorded every panel, every wheel, and every section of paint so there would be proof that the vehicle had no damage before I touched it. Then I checked the oak one more time. I inspected the ditch, the stump, and every strap. Everything needed to be precise. I positioned the soft straps around the rear differential where the metal structure could safely handle the load. No metal hooks touched the body. Nothing pressed against the bumper, and nothing rubbed against the paint. I connected the straps to the front loader of my tractor so I could maintain complete control over the lift. Then I raised the loader slowly. There was no sudden jerk and no dragging. Just a controlled upward movement until the rear wheels gradually lifted several inches off the ground. The front wheels rolled forward into the shallow rain-cut ditch and settled into place. I carefully guided the rear end over the wide stump and lowered it until the weight transferred evenly. When I was finished, the Escalade was sitting with its rear wheels suspended above the ground, its front end angled downward into the ditch, stable, untouched, and completely unable to drive away. I stepped back and studied it. It wasn't revenge. It was simply geometry. The next morning, Karen arrived expecting to drive away with her SUV like nothing had happened. Instead, she found it sitting there like a monument to one very bad decision. And right behind her came the sheriff. Karen jumped out of her friend's Lexus and started screaming before the vehicle had even completely stopped. "What did you do?" I was standing near the barn holding a cup of coffee. I looked at her and simply said, "Good morning." She stormed around the Escalade in disbelief, shouting that I'd vandalized her vehicle. I told her to inspect it herself. There were no dents, no scratches, no broken windows, and no visible damage anywhere. Deputy Trujillo arrived moments later and carefully inspected the entire setup. He checked the bumper, frame, axle straps, stump, ditch, and undercarriage. He took his time examining everything before finally standing up. Then he said, "Honestly, I've seen towing companies do worse when pulling vehicles out of ditches. This is cleaner than a dealership lift." Karen immediately demanded that he arrest me for theft. Instead, he explained that she had knowingly abandoned an undamaged vehicle on private property after repeated trespass warnings, and she was the one receiving the citation. You would think that would have ended the situation. Didn't. That evening, my phone started buzzing. A neighbor had sent me a link to Karen's latest performance online. The video was titled, "Evil Farmer Holds My Car Hostage." In it, she cried directly into the camera, claimed I'd attacked her, and told viewers that I'd used my tractor to hang her Escalade from a tree. She even claimed her children could have been inside the vehicle. Within an hour, the video had gathered tens of thousands of views, along with a flood of strangers calling me crazy. I didn't respond immediately. I waited. Then I uploaded one video of my own. No music, no dramatic narration, no editing tricks, just raw, time-stamped footage from my body camera and phone. It showed Karen repeatedly blocking my farm road. It showed her refusing to move during the storm while I was desperately trying to get emergency care for my injured heifer. It showed me documenting the abandoned Escalade and using padded straps to move it without causing damage. And it showed Deputy Trujillo examining the setup and saying it was cleaner than a dealership lift. I gave the video one simple caption, "Full context." The internet changed sides in less than 5 minutes. First came confusion, then outrage, but this time the outrage wasn't directed at me. People realized Karen had lied, had blocked a rancher during a livestock emergency, and had deliberately abandoned her own vehicle before threatening everyone with lawsuits. By midnight, her Escalade sitting on the stump had become an internet meme. Physics 1, HOA 0, $90,000 teeter-totter. The comments multiplied faster than Karen could delete them. But then the real collapse started. Shortly after 1 in the morning, screenshots from the HOA group chat began appearing online. Karen was typing in all caps, demanding that everyone stay united and stop posting anything. Someone finally responded that her own voice was recorded and that she'd lied to the group. At sunrise, I received an email with the subject line, "You didn't get this from me." Inside were HOA financial records sent by the assistant treasurer, receipts, spreadsheets, questionable spending, spa weekends, vehicle repairs, personal expenses paid through HOA funds, and a note that the message ended with one simple sentence, "I'm done covering for her." That was the exact moment this stopped being a petty neighborhood dispute and turned into a complete collapse of authority. Later that morning, a tow truck finally arrived. The driver walked around the Escalade twice, stared at the setup, looked at me and said, "What in the hell am I looking at?" I smiled and said, "Engineering." He laughed so hard he eventually had to brace himself against his knees. Karen wasn't laughing. She was hysterical and demanded that the SUV be brought down immediately. The tow driver told her he'd need her to sign a waiver because if the vehicle was scratched while he was getting it off the stump, he wasn't accepting responsibility. Karen refused to sign anything, so the driver packed up and left. Her expensive Escalade remained exactly where it was. That afternoon, I put everything together into one organized binder. Photographs, body camera footage, the sheriff's report, veterinary bills, property records, timestamps, screenshots, leaked HOA conversations, and the financial documents provided by the whistleblower. I labeled the file, Incidents Concerning HOA President Karen Salter. Then we went to court. Karen arrived with another attorney and the same attitude she displayed from the beginning. Loud, frantic, confident, and completely unprepared. Judge Calloway began with the question that mattered most. Did Karen have any documentation proving an easement existed? She didn't. No recorded easement. No access agreement. No legal document of any kind. Then she claimed that I had terrorized her and deliberately trapped her vehicle. The judge reviewed the sheriff's report and asked whether her vehicle had actually been damaged. She was forced to admit that it hadn't. Then he asked whether she had voluntarily left the vehicle on my property after repeatedly blocking my farm road, including during a livestock emergency. That question was much harder for her to answer. When it was my turn, I handed over the binder. Page after page, the entire story unfolded in order. The repeated trespassing, the horn incident, the injured heifer, the storm emergency, the blocked road, the abandoned Escalade, the careful, damage-free relocation, and finally the HOA financial records. By the time Judge Calloway reached the documents showing that Karen had allegedly used HOA funds to cover personal expenses, the courtroom had gone completely silent. The final ruling was straightforward. There was no easement, and there was no wrongdoing established on my part. Karen, however, had plenty of problems. The HOA was ordered to stop making any claims over my property. Karen was fined for false reporting and unlawful interference. She was ordered to cover the cost of the specialized crane that was eventually required to safely recover her Escalade. The financial records were also referred to the district attorney for a possible embezzlement investigation. Until that investigation was resolved, Karen was barred from serving in HOA leadership. She broke down, insisting that the ruling wasn't fair and that I'd ruined her life. Judge Calloway looked at her and gave her the simplest answer possible. She had done that to herself. By the time I returned home, the Escalade was finally gone. My heifer was back in the pasture, alive and recovering, and her newborn calf was standing beside her on shaky little legs. For the first time in weeks, the farm was quiet again. No luxury SUVs, no HOA delegations, no angry horns. Just the wind moving across the fields and the ordinary work that actually mattered. And honestly, that's the real lesson in all of this. Karen believed rules were flexible as long as she was confident enough. She believed property boundaries could be pushed, facts could be talked over, and consequences were something other people had to deal with. She assumed the threat of a lawsuit would frighten me more than her behavior had exhausted me. What she never understood was that some people argue simply because they enjoy arguing, while others document everything because they know evidence matters. I didn't defeat her with anger. I defeated her with patience, documentation, and a clear understanding of leverage. Some people learn when they're told no. Others learn after receiving a warning. And some only learn when the entire world finally refuses to move for